Aloha, welcome back to The Whole Gamut. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and I'm here with Professor Anukriti Hittle, who is a visiting scholar at the East-West Center. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we're here today to talk about the COP21, which you visited with a delegation of students. So how did that come about? How did you end up going to this event?
Well, I went there as a observer with the student delegation, and we are part of a larger civil society engagement effort on the part of the UN to try and make the process more transparent. And Washington University in St. Louis sent me as part of the faculty who were leading the group of students. So I was there for 1 week, and I had a colleague who was also leading it for 1 week. And it really, all of this has come about. It's an interesting phenomenon, having civil society engagement in here, and that's really something I would be interested in perhaps expanding upon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So, but before that, so Washington University is your home university.
That's right.
And you're at the East-West Center.
That's right.
How did you get, what is this fellowship you're on, and what research are you doing?
Okay. So I'm here at the East-West Center for a year, till the end of this academic year, so till June. I'm working on specifically two climate change related projects. One is from the mitigation side, and it really is looking at the global negotiations, looking at how those affect the climate change process, the issues, and so on. And because I was already involved with taking the students to the COP21, I knew that this would be a good topic for me to research on while I was here in Hawaii. So that's one side of it, and the other is really looking at adaptation efforts, and perhaps we could talk about that a little bit later
Absolutely.
on at the state level, at what the state of Hawaii is doing for climate change.
Absolutely. So you brought this delegation of students. What role do students and other civil society organizations play?
It's a really interesting phenomenon, I think, to have the civil society engagement. When the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, when that started, and that was back in 1992, it came into effect in 1994, really there wasn't a whole lot of engagement. When I worked in Washington, D.C. back then in the late 90s, the late 80s and early 90s, this was really a lot of what we did was based upon this outrage, if you want to call it that, which is that civil society was really not included in much of the high-level negotiations, either at the UN level, which is the global, or even in the multilateral development banks. And so we really pushed hard to be involved in the process and to be thinking about to have these institutions thinking about transparency so that we might be able to influence their agenda. For us, it was, of course, environmental issues, and climate change was, from the beginning, that was part of it. So it's really gratifying to see that now we are at the table. There are institutions, not just environmental institutions. So the UN has included several observer institutions, I guess, and they go from things like, they're called ENGOs, which are the environmental NGOs, the YOUNGOs, which are the young people's NGOs, what we are part of, the RINGOs, which are the research and independent NGOs, and then there are the BINGOs, which are the business and industry NGOs, and so on. So there are several of these, and we are part of that process. And we now sit down at the table, not at the negotiating table, but we influence the negotiations in certain ways. And I think that's really interesting to watch. Now that we have come to the table, we are part of the landscape. It's a very, it's really interesting to look at how that has come about and how far we have come, even though it does seem like it's been a long time.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the evolution of the COPs. And so you said a little bit that it started in the 80s and 90s where people were outraged that they weren't being involved. And when did the NGO and student involvement begin? And how has that development up to now really changed the way the negotiations are run?
Yeah, the negotiations are still very much led by the ministers and the heads of state and so on. And actually, it's more the ministers and the negotiating teams, not really the heads of state. Typically, what has happened is that the first week of the COP, there are 2-week sessions. And the first week, the COP, which is the Conference of the Parties, and these are the parties that are these are the countries that are party to the UNFCCC, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so you'll understand with the UN, we have a lot of acronyms. So the COP, which is the Conference of the Parties, the 196 parties to this convention, those started in 1995. This is the 21st one that just happened in Paris in December. And it's really been an evolving process with civil society engagement. So it's interesting to see how over the years you can really, there's been, the most obvious one is the direct action that goes on at the COP meetings. So you'll see a lot of you'll see a lot of demonstrators and people who will, young people, perhaps older people also, who will demonstrate and do direct action to influence and say, this is what we want. So there's a lot of that around climate justice issues, the 1.5 degrees Celsius that people were pushing for, that was up there at the COP meetings as well. And it's very interesting to see from some of the delegates and the attendees there that they're quite, many of them feel that this is easy to do and it's easy to shout and what will come of it. And this is something that I find very interesting because people often think that direct action doesn't have a role in our spectrum of activities and how it influences COP agendas. But it actually does. It makes our voices look moderate, and it really brings attention to the issues and then makes room for us to negotiate. It's almost like I would say like a Malcolm X and Martin Luther King kind of dynamic.
Yeah.
So and we were able to do that right from the beginning with organizations. I've seen that happen with organizations like Greenpeace, being able to do direct action and then bring in the people who will then talk to the multilateral development banks or to the UN, such as World Wildlife Fund and so on.
And what I've seen over the past 10 years is it really seems the climate change movement has become more professional. You know,
Yes.
and I started becoming interested in this. It was, yeah, a lot of NGOs and Greenpeace, but it was more, it seemed more extreme, more in the far left. And now it seems that, I mean, even our country, it's becoming the consensus. Around the world, it is definitely the consensus. Actually, let's talk about that a little bit. You know, the difference between, general perceptions of climate change in the United States and what you saw with delegations from around the world of the other INGOs.
Right. Well, that's it's a little bit misleading because of course you have a whole lot of people there who are interested in the issues, and that's why they're there, right? So it's a little skewed population. What's happening right there, though, is that they're trying to influence the actual negotiations. So it's a given that climate change is happening. Now, there was a threat of some Republican delegation maybe going there to do something and undermine Obama's work and so on. But those are things that really didn't catch the attention of most people there. It really was about how do you start to put in things like the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that actually did end up happening in the document. So countries have agreed to look at a less than 2 degrees Celsius rise, but they will pledge, they've made pledges, the nationally determined contributions, they've made those pledges towards that 2 degrees Celsius. But the 1.5 is really what island states wanted, and a bunch of other states wanted that. And so that is something we can see that's in the document at this point, that they will strive towards that. And that's one very concrete place where direct action and so on has influenced the agenda. There are other places where I see this engagement, and one of them is in how, for example, our students, what they did. So one of our students from last year, he was able to go to find his way into a country delegation this year. So, so that was really exciting for him to be able to observe that. And
so what's the difference between a country delegation and one of these student delegations?
Okay, so the student is an observer. The students are in the observer delegations. They don't actually do the negotiating. The country delegations actually go and do the negotiating. So they negotiate, and what comes out of the negotiations is that document, the Paris Agreement. And that will be open for signing next year. So it's different because you're actually doing your wordsmithing with your peers in other countries and so on. So for example, the United States will send a delegation about 200 people strong. India this year sent about 22 people or so. So it varies, but those are the people who are in the thick of things, and they're actually doing the negotiating. They're the parties to the convention. The rest of us are observers. So we're observing. The question is, how do those observers influence the negotiators? And that's what is so exciting, is that we actually influence those negotiators. So you see a lot of the back and forth between delegates and the negotiating delegates and the observer delegates. You see a lot of back and forth, not in the official settings, but it's all in these sort of small coffee areas, and they come to side events, to panel discussions that academics and think tanks put up.
Oh wow, so yeah, let's talk about that for a moment. So can you describe, when the negotiators are interacting with the observers, what that's like, and it sounds like it's a little more informal, but is there formal sessions? I mean, do negotiators tend to visit lots of different people, or do they tend to stick to certain,
Right.
and just go with what they believe?
Right.
So,
well, the answer is a bit of both, and a bit of all of the things that you mentioned. As you might imagine, there's so there are side events around the actual negotiating that's going on. These side events are really quite central to the state of the art, what is happening in climate change. So you'll find all the academics and think tank people and so on at these events. But sometimes you'll find there are delegates at these events too, who are listening to the state of the art, what's going on. How can they then go back and inform their party peers as to what's happening? So they're able to take information from us and send it on to their party delegations. That's one way they do it, by being in the audience. But I have seen panels where they've comprised of people from party delegations as well as observer delegations. So that's a very interesting back and forth that happens. And there's a lot of exchange on that. And of course, what you mentioned, which is at these sort of little coffee areas and so on, there's an informal give and take as well. So.
Wow, so what was the most interesting thing that you sat in on? What's something that really kind of either tugged at your heartstrings or just intellectually just kind of really captured you that maybe you didn't expect? Or?
Well, I'm not sure I could speak to what I didn't expect, but I did go and see the gurus of global governance talk about how the COP21 was proceeding, and those are Scott Barrett at Columbia University and Rob Stavens at Harvard University, and these are colleagues I have worked with, but really it was a pleasure and an honor to be able to see them and meet them and speak with them. So it's very exciting to be there, and it's a very high-powered sort of intellectual activity going on there, but it's also coming down to the very basic levels of how will this be implemented. So that was very exciting.
Well, this is all very exciting. Unfortunately, we have to cut to a quick break, and we'll be right back. Join us in a minute.
Aloha, this is Reg Baker, and I am the host of Business in Hawaii. We talk about positive stories of businesses in Hawaii, how they have been successful, and how they have overcome some of the obstacles that a lot of us encounter when we try to have a business here. And believe it or not, there are a number of positive stories here, and we want to talk to all of you. So we broadcast live every Thursday at 2 o'clock, and it rebroadcasts again on Olelo Channel 54. So I sure hope to see you next time. Please tune in on Thursdays at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Aloha, I'm Jim Sean, the host of Think Tech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers, interviews with people who have special insights into education from preschool through adult education. We are live streaming every Wednesday at noon, also posted on YouTube and the Hawaii Educational Policy Center. Please join us weekly for some of the amazing, innovative movers, shakers, and reformers in education in Hawaii. Aloha.
Aloha, and welcome back to The Whole Gamut. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and I'm here today with Professor Anu, and we're talking about the COP21 that she just attended with a delegation of students. And before the break, we were talking about how the role of students and civil society played in this COP. But now I'd like to ask, how have the COPs been run up until now?
Well, the COP21 was really interesting because it was slightly different. This was something that countries have been trying to get together It's the end of a long process. It's culminated in this Paris Agreement, and it's really what I think some folks don't understand maybe is that it started in 2011. So this process really has taken a few years to happen. So there was a lot of buy-in from countries that was needed, and along the way, they've come up with a script. Countries decided they did not want to deviate from that script. In Copenhagen in 2009 at COP15, they were really quite, everyone came away from that feeling like it was a failure. And because of that, they put certain things in place. And I think it's interesting, not just in how COP21 was unique, but perhaps in looking at the larger picture, which is what sort of effect does this have on the whole
Absolutely.
climate change issue? And this, was COP21 just yet another UN agreement, and ho-hum, why do we care about it? Why should we? Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that, for me, I feel that I went into it thinking, let's observe, let's see what happens out of this. But it's an incredible process where 196 parties come together at the global level. They're trying to get above that self-interest of nation states. They're trying to work towards a common goal. So it's collective action at its best, and it's peace at work. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. And this is how it looks. And so that's really exciting. I think that was really exciting for our students to look at as well. What other options do we have to get to that collective goal? And this is it. So I think for that reason, the whole UN process is very exciting. But the COP21 was unusual because in the 2-week meetings that you usually have, the heads of state come in at the end, at least for the last one they did and the one before that. In Copenhagen, they definitely came in at the end trying to salvage the process. This time, the heads of state all came in at the beginning. And they came in for the one day to show intent and to show that they were interested and they really meant it. And I think that was spectacular. It also, I think, coalesced as part of the sort of family of nations mm-hmm. after the Paris attacks. And there was a real feeling of let's try and make this work. There was a script that they all followed, so no one deviated from that script. It had all been told to us beforehand, which is these are the pledges. They were called the nationally determined contributions. And we knew what those pledges were going to be.
So is this normal? Do they usually say that what the pledges are going to be beforehand? Or is this new?
Well, the whole thing about having pledges is new. Mm-hmm. They did have pledges for the Kyoto Protocol, but that was just from the developed countries, and the US was not a party to it. Mm-hmm. And at the time, China, the biggest polluter now, was not a party to it. And so Kyoto Protocol covered about 14%, right?
So what effect do you think the US-China agreements on climate change that happened earlier this year had on the success of this COP21?
Funny you should mention that, because that was something that I looked at in a paper that I co-wrote.
Oh, great.
And it's a working paper. If people are interested, it's on my website. But essentially, we looked at how do these pledges, what do they look like as they go out into the future? And basically, it looks like China and the US are going to garner about 40% of that carbon pie, which is what we call it, which is what we can afford to emit. And they're going to be emitting about 40% of that. They have only 20% of the world's population. And so that seems like the rest of the world has to really shape up and start cutting emissions now. And it seems pretty unfair. So
this is a bit of a switch from previous COPs and previous years where it was like, oh, the US and China, you're not doing enough, and now they're saying, well, we're going to do the bulk of it.
They're doing the bulk, but what they're doing is they're not doing enough. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's always a complaint, but it's fairly insidious, I think, because they're almost colluded to pollute while looking like the good guys. Right. So yes, they have an agreement now, but the agreement is that they together will be the major polluters. Mm. That's the agreement.
So it's not about, it's telling other countries, well, you can't meet what we're doing. We're the biggest powers now, so.
Mm-hmm. And it's really making other countries feel like, well, we too would like to emit and grow the same way that you did, unless we get mm-hmm. technologies that will help us. And that really is the crux of the matter, right? Because you're looking at funding for shifting from that carbon intensive to renewables or non-fossil fuels.
What I find interesting about, in China, at the top levels, people definitely are very committed to climate change and reducing emissions. I mean, this is even like a bit of a national security issue because it's causing so much disruption. And then at the bottom levels, the everyday person in China, especially after the Under the Dome movie that came out last year, people are also very interested because they have effects on health. There's effects on fertility. People can't conceive in some of the larger cities, the more polluted cities. There's cancer rates are skyrocketing, et cetera, et cetera. And in the United States, you see at a very, maybe at the top levels, not so much, but at grassroots levels, whether or not people even believe in climate change, there's a lot of changes happening, to make, even smaller cities more efficient and cut down on waste and become more organic. So it's interesting that even though we are polluting so much, there's definitely a shift in the past, I'd say, decade in both these countries on all levels.
Yes, I agree. And I think we can talk more about the subnational level in a little bit, but at the global level, it's still very interesting to see which countries sent whom for the negotiations. So for example, France, every COP has its presidency, and France had put its foreign minister in charge. Very high profile person.
Absolutely.
The US sent Secretary of State Kerry. India sent its environment minister, Javadekar, who is, from what I understand, somewhat of a nobody over there.
Right.
And so it's interesting to see who was sent.
Yeah.
And just who attends these meetings.
And where the priority lies. And it's actually France is a very liberal country and prides itself on sustainability and everything.
Right.
There's a lot of nuclear power happening, et cetera. But it's interesting that France would prioritize this more from at least this perspective than India, because India seems to have a lot of problems with getting electricity. There seems to be a big boom in renewable, especially since the coal power usage has been going down in India, and there are some surprises at this COP.
Yes, and it was interesting to see. Of course, India has a lot of problems where it's trying to get just electricity to its 300 million people, which is the size of the United States, essentially.
Wow.
So it has different priorities, and the crux of the issue is really in how is it going to make that transition, and that's where we get into the funding, and that's the other thing that this process has done, is it has established the largest climate fund. Now, people will argue that it's not enough, and it isn't, but it's called the Green Climate Fund, and it's $100 billion a year starting in 2020 that will go into climate technologies and other projects. It's something that I think it's definitely not enough. I mean, it's going to be the numbers, just to put 100 billion in perspective, and I'd mentioned this before, is that Americans in 2013 spent about $83 billion on potato chips. So we're talking 100 billion on climate projects a year.
Yes, the numbers are a little bit misleading sometimes. I mean, that sounds like a lot to me.
Sounds like a lot.
Can't imagine what $100 billion looks like. But
or what $83 billion of potato chips looks like.
Oh, yeah. Man, that must be towers full of potato chips. So, did you find that this COP was more technology forward focused, or is it behavioral? What were people talking about a lot there? Was it a mix of everything?
Yeah, it was really, a lot of it was the transparency and monitoring issues and things like that. So it really was still about the agreement itself. Money is always an issue, so funding. The small island states were clamoring for loss and damage. They managed to get that into the document, but not actual amounts. So because they knew that the US would not be able to sign on to anything with amounts in it, it would have to go through the congressional treaty ratification process to do that, and everyone was very cognizant of that. So that was an interesting other dynamic that was going on, that everyone wanted the United States to be part of this. Without it, it's not going to work, because the United States is the second largest emitter. And without it, we would have been back in the days of Kyoto, Kyoto Protocol. So that was a really interesting dynamic. The other thing that happened is that the French COP president, who was the foreign minister, Laurent Fabius, he had a really skillful way of getting people together. So he basically cut through the BS, if you want to call it that, and he made people talk to each other only if they had something new to add. So that was interesting as well. These are things that we heard from, these were all under closed, there were parts of the negotiations that were closed, and again, our civil society participants felt like, well, why is this closed? We need it to be open. But I think it actually sped the process up for it to be closed. In some ways, it slows it down when we're there sometimes, because it just, they have to posture when we're watching.
Absolutely.
And everyone knows, yes, we know this is happening in your country, we know the heat waves, et cetera, but move on is what we've heard.
Right.
Yeah.
So if, if we started this COP with the pledges and the leaders met at the beginning, what role did, the civil society organizations have, and what did they affect then? Because the pledges were already there. Was it, how countries were going to implement the pledges, or the details of it? What did you find?
Yeah, I mean, so the script is basically written, and it's really looking at the surprises were things like 1.5, putting 1.5 in there. So that was not there before, and that is something that civil society basically helped with. So I think, that's a really big thing. And I think that getting into those pledges, that's where civil society has also helped. So it's really happened over time. It's not just at the COP. And that's, again, something I wanted to stress, is that this has been a long process. It's the culmination of several years of work. And between COPs, so the COPs meet once a year, between the COPs, there are several meetings that these folks have, and the governments meet and so on. And so we've had 4 of those meetings this past year in 2015, leading up to the COP. So it's really during those times that civil society is able to have some effect. And there was a little bit more at the COP, but the COP is really the end product. It's okay, here's the cake, it's all baked, and we're going to put the icing on it, and that's pretty much it.
Right, it's the ribbon cutting.
Exactly.
Oh, so interesting. So tell us a little bit more about the internal negotiations. What were happening there?
Yeah, it was really interesting. There were 2 plenary halls, and because they expected so many participants, they needed to have an overflow room. So that was different from other COPs too, where they really needed more space. And it was held at an old airfield, so it was a pop-up city. Basically, it was like Burning Man.
Right.
Not quite the same, but something like that. And inside, in the big plenaries, we could sit down, and there was simultaneous translation and so on. The parties were all up front, and then the observer organizations would sit behind the party delegates. And the rest of us would go into the overflow room if there wasn't any room. But then the negotiations also, at the end of the first week, they had the COP president had something called the Comité de Paris, which was like a smaller working group. He basically put together ministers who would head up different articles of the paper, of the agreement. And then they could flow back and forth between those. So they would just they called them indabas, which is, I guess, an Arabic term for just informal working groups. And so they had these indabas, which they had formed. And it was really interesting to see that. Then they would report, those were all closed negotiations. And so then they would come out and they would report, okay, at 9 o'clock this evening, we will have a draft ready for you. So then they would present the draft to the parties and to the observers all at the same time, which is something...
That's interesting. Wow.
Yes, and so the parties themselves, too, would see that draft for the first time. Then they would need a few hours to negotiate.
So was this more effective, do you believe?
I think it was really skillful because it involved everybody. It presented things to the observers at the same time, so we didn't feel, even though it was closed and we were not able to get into some of those negotiations, I feel like, this is the best they could do. This was again what peace at work looks like, and I thought it was effective for what it is, an international agreement.
Wow, I love that phrase, peace at work. That's a great way to describe it. We're going to cut to a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back.
Okay, this is Think Tech Hawaii, and it's Wednesday. Every Wednesday is Energy Wednesday here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy. 4 to 5 p.m. every Wednesday. Come and listen to us. And just to show you what I mean, I'm going to ask Sharon to tell us more.
Come and see us every Wednesday, as Jay said. And we have people like Jim Albers from HECO, here and co-host Ray Starling here every Wednesday. We not only go on Olelo and OC16, but also stream live. So please come visit us, hear about the latest in clean energy.
Okay, Jim, you've been here. You got any comment on all this?
As important as energy is in all of our lives today, this is a great forum and a great format to vet those issues. So I encourage everybody to listen in and participate.
Okay, Ray, what do you think for a close?
Well, I think this is the greatest show in the energy world here in Hawaii. You can come here every week, 1 hour, and catch the latest on what's happening and hear from the people who really know what's going on, like Jim Alberts. We appreciate your coming today.
Thank you.
Ray Starling, Sharon Moriwaki, Jim Alberts, and Jay Fidel here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy, 4 to 5
Aloha.
p.m. Wednesday. Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha. Welcome back to The Whole Gamut. I'm your host, Hillary Weinberg, and I'm here with Professor Anu. And we have so much to talk about because we have 15 minutes left to talk about the COP21, which was a several-week-long, 190 country-wide, plus NGOs and all the other organizations event, and how we can even sum it up in 15 minutes. I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to give it a try. So let's talk about the role. We've talked about the NGOs, we've talked about the governments and the main ministers. Let's talk about the subnationals now. What was their role?
Okay, well, first of all, when you started talking about having all the NGOs and so on, I was thinking, oh, wow, it was the whole gamut, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, so, I feel like this was progress. People say it wasn't. I feel like it was progress, but it's not a solution.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel it's something that, just kind of leading into your question, something I'd like to read out, a quote from Jeffrey Sachs, who is an economist at Columbia University, the Earth Institute. And he says, "The diplomats have done their job. The Paris Agreement points the world in the right direction and with sophistication and clarity. It does not, however, ensure implementation, which necessarily remains the domain of politicians, businessmen, scientists, engineers, and civil society." So it really is sort of bringing it back down to, so the countries have done what they were supposed to do in their diplomatic fields. Now, what do the rest of us do? And what does it mean for the United States? What does it mean for the states of the United States, for Hawaii, for Hawaii's municipal governments, city governments, all over the United States and all over the world, really, what does this mean? So really bringing it down to the subnational players, because that's where the implementation will happen, right? That's where you're looking at adaptation to climate change. You're looking at trying to cut back emissions. You're trying to look at technology transfer and use of better technology and all kinds of things that are going to happen at the subnational level.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to mean things like, for example, just taking Hawaii, which is a leader, I believe, in some of the state level action that has happened from both the mitigation and the adaptation side. So the mitigation is cutting back emissions, and the adaptation is what you do with the damage or the loss or the climate change effects that you're feeling, right? So or you're experiencing. So with the mitigation side, there's the Clean Energy Initiative, and that's something that's one of the most ambitious goals that any state in the United States has for energy transformation. And it's looking at going from being one of the most fossil fuel dependent states to being 100% renewable by 2045.
Hopefully our electricity bills will go down too.
Hopefully, yes, and that's the tricky aspect too. So that's from the mitigation side, and then we're looking at things like, and that's something that the Hawaiian government is going to have to implement.
Right.
Then we're looking at something like on the climate adaptation side, the legislature has put together a committee, an Interagency Climate Adaptation Committee, or ICAC. And they're looking specifically at sea level rise. They will give a report to the legislature in 2017. They will take a look at some vulnerability assessments and risks, and then make some recommendations, I presume, but also put in just what kinds of things, where are the needs for the state of Hawaii, and then the legislature will hopefully go from there. So it's really that's at the state level what's happening. So it's an interesting interesting place for that implementation to happen, right? It's not just at the government level. And I was reading something in the Washington Post yesterday about two researchers who've been working on perception of climate change and what the government should do, and they've done this for a couple of years now. They've been looking and following this issue. And it's about, let me see if I can, so it's 63% of people in the United States feel that climate is a concern. So that's quite high, which, I mean, I think it's higher than it has been. 63% think that. And 47% feel the government should do something. So there's still a big chunk of people who think that there need to be other entities, such as business or citizenry.
I'd say that businesses and citizens have, I mean, everything's organic and sustainable now, and
Right.
I think people are buying into it, which is great.
And I think that's another thing, is that it may not come under climate change necessarily. It may not be. It may be more under public health issues or sustainability issues, things like that. So it's not. It may not be cast as climate change, but it certainly is about climate change as well, because climate change, of course, covers so many different things.
Right, of course.
So I think that these kinds of actions will help, and there are states. I know that looking at sea level rise, I know that New York has done a sea level rise assessment. I know that San Francisco Bay Area, they've been working on things like that. They're actually trying to put together a green. They're trying to create a wetland that will deal with wastewater.
Oh, wow.
And filter wastewater. So, and provide resiliency on the coast for sea level rise and for storm events.
And New York City, they're reintroducing different mollusks that are native to the area, and that helps prevent major storms from impacting as much. So there's all sorts of interesting things that are going on subnational levels.
That's right. And not just city governments that are trying to cut back on carbon emissions and so on, but also looking along coastlines to make them more resilient, to make them more green, and to deal with the adaptation effects.
And actually, there are cooperations between cities and states in the United States and in China, which is wonderful and really interesting. That and China is doing green zones and blue zones, which is addressing this as well.
Right. And of course, none of this is nearly enough.
No, never.
And we need to gain momentum on this. So but it's really, the point is that it's really going to be at that subnational level that the action will happen. And the question is, how do we make that happen?
Right. So is there federal funding?
Right.
Is there tax breaks? I mean,
exactly.
What is the federal government, can the federal government do to allow and enable the subnationals, whether it's the states or the cities or companies, to implement these changes?
Right. So it's not only the funding, and you've hit on it. It's the funding, but it's also the policies.
Right.
What policies can be put in place, and are there laws that need to happen that will make states do things, or will it the Clean Power Plan?
And arguably, what I've seen is people just need some sort of consistency from our federal government, because it seems that whoever controls the House or the Senate, there's just so much inconsistency with all these bills that it prevents people from getting anything done.
That's right.
So I wonder how that will unfold in the future. Do you have any ideas?
Well, it's interesting because we don't want it to go the way of fracking,
right?
Which is just left up to the state level. So this is something that we really want to try and have happen. There's a certain amount that needs to happen at the global level, then a certain amount that needs to happen at the national level, and then that enables the subnationals to do their work. So you're right, there are a lot of these sister cities that are working on some of these things, and I think they'll come up with some solutions. I met with some folks from Norway who are working in small towns in Norway and municipal governments there.
That's interesting.
And so, I was trying to convince them that Hawaii was a better place to work, actually. But yes, and so they're working on those kinds of issues, and there's similar issues, very similar. And how do you get the federal government to create an atmosphere that's conducive to these actions?
Right. While also addressing some of the many other problems our federal government is dealing with.
That's right.
But a lot of these, climate change is connected to a lot of the problems that our government is dealing with, whether the economy or some wars, which are being exacerbated by, like migration, being exacerbated by climate change and change in weather and desertification. So there's really so much of this all ties back into.
Right. And I think this is again one of the things that, because this is such a wide range of things, and the problem seems so intractable. That's something that I feel we give our students is this is something that you can work on through the global process. You can work on some of these issues and try and help people, not just students, but all of us to get beyond that outrage. Just figure out how can we be part of that solution, whether it's at the global, national, or subnational level.
So what did you find that your students brought back with them? What did they take from this COP, and what did you learn from taking students there?
Oh, it's a really exciting atmosphere. I know that first of all, it's so hands-on that they are very turned on by it. So sometimes we would leave at 8 a.m. and they wouldn't come back until 2 a.m.
Wow.
Of the next day. So so they get very, very engaged. It's a very intense process.
Absolutely.
And they bring back a lot of messages of how global interaction happens.
Right.
And again, how does that look at the global level? How does it look like to have nations peacefully negotiating big issues? And I think that's the biggest message that they bring back.
Wow. So what would people who are interested in the COPs and interested in, this paper you're writing, we're going to put the link to your website on the ThinkTech website so we can share some of your research. But, if people are interested in this and getting involved, what do you recommend?
There are a couple of places. One is the very intractable UNFCCC site. If you need a translation, to that, I would say the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. If people look at that, that gives you summaries of all environmental negotiations, not only the UNFCCC, and that's an excellent resource. I would also look at Rob Stavens's blog and Scott Barrett's blog. So these are at Harvard and Columbia Universities, respectively. So I'd look at their blogs as well, and they really have some very interesting and clear things to say. Yeah.
So what are you excited about in your research? What's next for you?
Well, this is interesting you would ask that. It's something that I would be working on next is looking at how Hawaii's pledges will do towards getting the United States closer to its goal of its own pledges nationally. So we're going to look at it at a state level, and that should,
that's wonderful.
Morph into some sort of a working paper.
Well, it's been so wonderful having you on the show today.
Thank you. It's been a
really
pleasure.
Appreciate you coming on, especially since you were just on Friday with another host. And all this work you've been doing is so great, and hopefully we'll hear from you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. This has been The Whole Gamut.